when they said a non-concordist interpretation of Genesis 1 was better. And I could easily...
To Scripture.
Yes.
In Scripture on its own terms.
Right.
Not letting modern science set an agenda for how we read Scripture.
Right. And I know I've read a lot of people who take a concordist interpretation of Genesis 1 who see a non-concordist interpretation of Genesis 1 as meaning that you're not taking Scripture as authoritative anymore, and I completely reject that argument. Okay, the non-concordist interpretation of Genesis 1, that as I understand them, are fully take Scripture as authoritative, take it extremely seriously, and given how we ought to interpret Scripture, are actually better interpretations. Now, I stand ready to be convinced, and I'm some fraction of the way there. I stand ready to be convinced that by similar arguments that a non-concordist interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3 not only takes the authority of Scripture very seriously, but is also better given what we understand about the literature of the ancient Near East, the kinds of questions which the original author and audience would have had in mind. I want to hear that debate. I want to hear more of that debate on concordist versus non-concordist interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3. Here and then here. So yes?
My question is about one of the earlier slides where you mentioned that the traditional view of the church has been that Adam and Eve are recent ancestors.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, what is the difference between maybe the traditional view and the scientific creationism which exists today, which is tied to sort of like flood geology? So in the earlier church, they might have had a view, maybe a view of a younger Earth, but what's the difference between that and then sort of post-flood geology?
No, I take the first scenario, the recent ancestors scenario, to be the one of the young Earth creationist movement. Now, it's probably the case that if you look throughout history of the church, a lot of theologians over the last 2,000 years would have had sort of a recent ancestors view of Adam and Eve that looks nothing like modern young Earth creationism. But nevertheless, I think that my reading of young Earth creationists is that they take some subset of recent ancestor views that have been in the history of the church and say that's the right view. Yes, Clarence.
This is a very different question, and maybe
good,
or maybe not. I would like to know what you perceive as our responsibility and our human mandate of subduing the motions of the continental plates and earthquakes.
Boy, not in this century. You know, I think when we do genetic engineering of plants and animals, we're not playing God, we're playing image of God. When we cure disease, we're playing image of God. If the time comes where we say, you know what, we can get all the benefits of stopping the continental plates from moving and none of the harm, yeah, probably we'd be better off just not building over earthquake faults. So, you know, I don't imagine we'll be stopping that, but we might do more. I mean, okay, when we mandate building codes such that if you're building in a fault zone, you have to have certain codes of building, that's subduing the earth, okay, in the right sort of sense. Yes?
But a wrinkle to the subduing problem is the mixed bag that you talked about with biology, that you have, you know, organisms that within one context are weedy, nasty, obnoxious buggers.
Yep.
And in a totally different context, that same organism is a source of beauty and of diversity.
Yep. You're right.
It leads to the functioning of the system.
You're right. You're right. So we got to be careful. So if we can wipe out malaria, parasite, let's do it. Okay. But I don't think we should wipe out crabgrass if we can do it. Okay? And we need biologists to help us figure out what are the consequences of what we do.
I'm not willing to wipe out malaria yet.
Okay, okay. Here we go, and then there.
Okay, what would you say to people who would say that like consequences of climate change or things like that are a result of humans trying to subdue the earth?
I would say yes. Climate change is a result of humans trying to subdue the earth. Okay, we mess everything up. Okay, you know, we're sinful. It started with us just not being aware. Now that we're aware, we ought to be behaving a lot better than we are behaving. So yes, of course, there's unintended consequences. We as limited human beings, and as fallen human beings, we're going to do things, even when we believe we've got the best knowledge currently available and the best motives we can have, are going to do things which, we didn't foresee that. Okay, then we'd better change what we're doing. Yes?
I wonder if concordism is the most useful framework or category with which to deal with Genesis 2 and 3. Genesis 1, I know there's been this attempt to do that. And the reason that I wonder about Genesis 2 and 3 is that I take a figure like Augustine. Augustine is utterly unworried about the age of the earth and conforming to, geology or Darwin or whatever. But he describes his literal commentary in the book of Genesis is very symbolic. Yet, the issue with Genesis 2 and 3 has to do much more with Romans 5 and with a overall understanding and his arguments with Pelagius, for example. There's different issues going on there, it seems to me. And to simply say that being convinced of the importance, I think you put your finger on the importance of it, an act that is singular and important, of rebellion that is singular and important and has historical and cosmic consequences of some sort. That's the issue. For Augustine, it had to do, concordism isn't quite the right category.
Good. But would you say Augustine's philosophy or theology of sin and redemption relies on there sort of being a state of original righteousness?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, I take your point very well. Concordism and non-concordism may be the wrong framework for thinking on exactly that issue, and I would like to work on that some more. Okay, John and then Brian.
Well, Loren, between an earth that needs subduing and an earth that was created evil, have you thought about the patristic view that Satan was kicked out of heaven and came down on the earth and was sort of trashing the earth quite a long time before Adam and Eve, so that in principle, given the laws that God put to the universe, it could have been functioning a little bit better than it is. I mean, there are the same laws, but the sort of amount of dissonance and destruction that actually obtains needn't obtain given that same order, but it got that way because somebody threw it off balance, or, I mean, so what about the theory of an angel fall as responsible for at least some of the natural evil, and that being the source of the world in which humans now both needed maybe to do some subduing, but were also challenged by what wasn't so good?
Yes, I've certainly heard that and thought about that and entertained that. And I have read theologians who put the word Manichaean on that idea and throw it out immediately for the idea. But, okay, let's set that aside. I'm going to now call up what I know about physics and biology. The fundamental laws of nature, I'm going to say, they have not changed. So if you're going to talk about fallen angels mucking it up, it's not going to be the fundamental laws of nature. What about in the biological realm? Well, when I look at all the parasites and all the disease organisms, as well as all the cool symbiotes out there, I don't see... It looks to me like the laws of nature that God put in place, the capabilities of evolutionary biology that God put in place, not only can, but really would produce all of those things. I don't think, it's always a question. You run the scenario backwards. I could imagine a scenario where good and evil are adding more predators and parasites and more symbiotes, but I think it comes about through the natural mechanism itself. So now you start to ask the question, well, what about if it's not in the predators and the parasites and the disease organisms, maybe it's in the human psychology, maybe nudging human beings one way or the other. Well, now you're back to human origins, okay? At what point might God have not only started revealing himself to early human beings by whatever means, voice of conscience, whatever, but also permitted fallen angels to start tempting? Okay? I don't think I can spot that in the genome or in evolutionary psychology. I will say this, though. I am convinced by the very preliminary theories of evolutionary psychology that we don't need supernatural action to get early human beings with a mixture of selfishness and altruism and rule and cheating and rule obeying. So if there was more of that due to supernatural action, I don't think I could detect it. Okay, a follow-up on that specific point? Okay.
Suppose we both affirm that God acts supernaturally because he's omnipresent and naturally. Then, some of the things that you said made me raise this question. At what point do you move beyond the sort of methodological naturalism and sort of phenomenology that you need to do natural science, and legitimately so, and sort of begin to draw what might be called naturalistic metaphysical conclusions? Or to what extent, just what you say, why do you need to be able to see in the natural record some evidence of what might have been some non-empirical, although perfectly worldly, spiritual activity of God in the world? And what about the whole paradigm would change if we're running both at the same time and not making any sort of judgments that privilege one as opposed to the other? And I'm not accusing you.
Right.
Because I tend to be someone who approaches the whole business saying God's supernaturally active, he's transcendently active, he's also immanently active, and I'm not going to a priori dictate just which proportions or when the so-called interventions or this or that. If you set it up that way, then a whole lot of this thing gets just approached in a different framework.
Yeah, I'll think about that some more. One point to add off to the side is, of course, I keep talking about divine revelation. When we're talking about divine revelation to human beings, especially early human beings, and divine establishment of relationship and promises, now we're talking about supernatural activity, okay? Detectable or not, clearly that's something that's beyond the natural world. Now, in answer to your question, I suppose, I'm going to try and come up with a better answer than this, but this is my preliminary answer. Because I'm a Reformed Christian trained to do science and trained to think scientifically, my inclination is, if I've got some event that I can look at and study scientifically, if I see that, that can be explained in terms of the natural mechanisms that God put in place without the need for anything else, then I'm going to take that as the probable explanation. I can't prove it, and we've had talks about chance. When something, the lot is cast in the lap, its every decision is from the Lord. If we have a quantum mechanical event and it's a 50% chance of turning out this way and 50% chance of turning out that way, and so far as we know, the laws of nature don't decide one way or the other, do I think God decides every one of those events or not? Well, I don't think Calvinism requires me to say that God does, although it's certainly compatible with Calvinism to say that God does. So I need to think more about what you're saying, because I know there's a few other people at Calvin who are making exactly that point. That to say, if the scientific